So, good morning. It's wonderful to be back, and we had a very good trip. We went to San Francisco, where we were part of a very formal, beautiful ceremony to honor the life work of psychiatrist Stanislav Grof. And it was sold out. I think there were 700 people there. And we got to connect with a lot of old friends and also to really honor his work. And he is a true pioneer of psychology and spirituality. And then we also went to New Mexico, where we did one of our gender equity and reconciliation programs at Ghost Ranch. Some of you may have heard of Ghost Ranch. And that was with a group called Illumin, which is a men's rites of passage organization founded by Father Richard Rohr, the Franciscan priest who founded the Center for Action and Contemplation. So they brought a group of their leadership, and we had a very powerful 5-day intensive there in New Mexico. And here we are, glad to be back. God is a consuming fire, so we read in the book of Hebrews 12:29. God is love. So love is therefore a consuming fire, or as I like to think of it, love is a transforming fire. How can we understand this? As the great Carmelite mystic St. John of the Cross explains, when the flame of divine love is first applied to the soul resists it and refuses it. Just as a log, when you place a log in a fire, at first it smokes and it hisses, but eventually the log yields. It takes that love into itself, and it then begins to burn hot and bright. And so the very log becomes an ambassador of the fire itself. And so it is with the soul, that when the soul is purified by divine love, it becomes what John of the Cross called a living flame of love in its own right. But now consider, when you first place the log in the fire, what happens? It turns dark, it turns black, it weeps with the sap and all of the impurities, and they start smoking and hissing. And this is often how we respond when God begins to purify us. Sound familiar? We say, no, stop this torture. And sure enough, if we were to respond that way with the log, if we rescued the log from the fire, then the log would recover and sort of brush the soot off itself and wipe the sap and finally feel all like a good solid log, grateful for having survived the ordeal, right? And this is exactly how the ego responds to the invitation for union with God. The ego wants God to become the log, but God wants the log to become the fire. This is the problem. And so the ego wants God on its terms. I want union with God. That all sounds very good. But the ego wants God to become it. And God, rather, wants to take that log of the ego and basically purify it so it becomes an instrument of the divine fire. And so this is the goal. And when the log, if you leave that log in the fire, eventually it starts to burn clean. It stops hissing. It takes that fire into itself. The fire becomes one with the log. And then it burns hot and clean and bright. No resistance, no noise. You can still see the log in there. You can still see its outlines. Now, if you took that log out before, it just sat there, it became a log, and if you took it anywhere else, it would just be a log. But if you now take this burning log out of the fire, wherever you take it, it starts another fire. Because that fire is burning with the fire of God, if you will. And that is what happens to the soul. Once we are transformed into an instrument of God, wherever we go, we start that same fire of love. Now, John of the Cross identifies different stages in this purifying fire, which he famously called the dark night of the soul. So there is the night of sense, which is the purification of essentially our attachment to the sense experience. And then there's a night of spirit, which is a deeper purification within the depths of the heart. And then Father Thomas Keating has identified another stage, which he calls the night of self. And all of these are stages in this process of purification. However, as Carl Jung said insightfully, he said, unfortunately, this is a disagreeable process. And so for that reason, many people don't engage in it. Let me share you a little story with you. Back in the 1980s, when I was a young physicist, I began practicing silent meditation and embarked on various forms of spiritual training disciplines. I read many of the popular books at the time, Ken Wilber, Roger Walsh, Francis Vaughan, Stanislav Grof, Jack Kornfield. And of course, I also read many books on science and spirituality, including a seminal work called The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. How many of you have actually read that book or heard of it? So, and at that time I entered into an intensive 3-year training with psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, the one I mentioned earlier. And in that training, one of our projects, one of our assignments, if you will, was to report back on various books and topics. So one day during the training, one of the other students gave a presentation on the Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. And this really was a seminal work in the entire field of science and spirituality, showing deep parallels between the cutting edge of physics and essentially Taoism or universal mysticism. And during this other student's presentation, I began to raise questions and bring in different perspectives from quantum physics and relativity theory. And as I continued, I began to challenge this whole correspondence between physics and spirituality. Now, being the only research physicist in this training group, it was not difficult for me to make my arguments in an incisive way, and using special concepts and insights from physics that were largely unfamiliar to the other trainees. So it made my whole argument difficult to refute. And I, of course, spoke with confidence and precision and came away with a sense that I had performed an important service in the training group. The next day, I entered into one of these breathwork sessions. Now, this particular program was focused on the practice of holotropic breathwork, which is a powerful method of self-exploration developed by Stanislav Grof and his wife, Christina. And it entails deep breathing with music and with sitters and facilitated support. And what it does is it opens and awakens deeper levels of the unconscious and brings them into conscious awareness. It's one of many different types of breath work. And during my particular breathwork session that day, I had a painful revelation about myself, which was that the day before, when I had challenged this other trainee's presentation about the Tao of Physics, I had actually been coming from a place of self-important pretense and posturing. I realized, to my horror, that I'd been filled with a kind of arrogant superiority, and that in truth my entire motivation in criticizing this presentation was motivated by a deep envy of Fritjof Capra. I wished that I had written that book. I was a physicist after all. I was deeply interested in spirituality, and I admired that book deeply and had been inspired by it. And so I wished I'd written it. All of that was under my radar that day when I was critiquing the presentation, but it all came in a flood during this breathwork session. Now, as you can imagine, after that breath session, I was mortified because now I had a huge dilemma. The agonizing fires of purification were raging within me because I had taken such an arrogant and pretentious stance the day before, but I had done it in front of the entire group. So I realized that I'd been posturing as the brilliant and discriminating scientist who was privy to some special insight and wisdom. As Jack Kornfield likes to note, self-knowledge is often bad news. And it certainly was bad news that day. So now I had this dilemma. I realized I had to share this discovery with the group, and it was our standard practice in this training to share about our breathwork experiences. Of course, there was the option not to share about this aspect of my experience. You know, I could privately acknowledge my error, accept the humbling, and take it as an important lesson, never to repeat it in the future. You know, never to, will I do this again? A foolish blunder I'll never repeat. And that is sometimes the best approach to take under such circumstances. But in this case, I had publicly pontificated and postured before this entire group, pretending to superior insight and knowledge, when all along I was motivated by the insidious poison of envy. And I realized that, quite contrary to my public stance, in fact, I had a profound respect and admiration for the remarkable work of Fritjof. So I was tempted to keep this all to myself. But if I did that, then I would be doubly in shadow. First, by the arrogant posturing itself, and second, by then keeping it all covered up as if nothing had happened. And of course, all this in the name of spiritual practice, integrity, and purity, right? So the fires of agony were burning in me on multiple levels, and I knew the bottom line was I really had no choice. I just had to share this with the group and take the consequences. And the group consisted of about 40 trainees and faculty. So it was daunting. And I spent the rest of that day in tremendous remorse and shame, filled with a kind of inner doom and gloom. I was completely morose, kept to myself, avoided connecting with other people. It was torturous, and I was burning inside and genuinely fearful that I might be ostracized or would lose the respect of everyone in the group and possibly be shunned or at least become the laughingstock of the group. So I was dreading that evening, and I did not know really how to share this. But finally the moment came that evening, the dreaded moment when it was my turn to share. And with reluctance and trepidation, I just plunged in, wanting to get it done and over with. I shared about my breathwork experience and the realization of my earlier pretense and posturing, motivated by sheer envy. At one point as I spoke, someone in the group burst out laughing. And then the whole group quickly followed suit and broke out in laughter. I couldn't believe it. I was stunned. I had expected a somber and judgmental response, and instead they were all laughing. And it was not a hostile laughter, but it was just the opposite, and it broke the spell. The bubble was burst, and the absurdity of the ego's pretentious games was nakedly revealed, in this case my ego, and it was all totally hilarious. So I started laughing too, and as I looked around the group, I felt tremendous support and appreciation coming from all of them, recognizing the folly of the human egoic pretenses. And there was a very deep and profound release within me in that experience. Now, this is but a small example of the process of spiritual purification by fire. And in this case, the ego's games, it refers to the ego's games that create and support the false self. As the Sufi mystic Irina Tweedy says, when she went to India to meet her and met her sheikh, her great spiritual master, she expected that he would give her profound experiences of spiritual wisdom, insight, and the peace that passeth all understanding. And instead, what she got were experiences of her own darkness. And as she says, it nearly killed her. Now, there's one more twist to my story. A couple weeks after this whole episode with in the breathwork training, the phone rang one weekend afternoon. I was out on the deck visiting with friends, and they all knew about this breathwork story. And my partner at the time came out from the kitchen and said, "Phone's for you." And with a smile, she added, "It's Fritjof." And of course, we all roared with laughter. It was like, that was a great joke at her clever joke. I went inside and was still laughing when I took the phone, and there was a very earnest voice on the line with a distinctive Austrian accent and said, "Hello, this is Fritjof Capra." And I realized with a shock, it really was him. I couldn't believe my ears. And Fritjof proceeded to ask me about a research paper I had recently published that analyzed different strategies for abating global warming and mitigating climate change. He wanted me to write an article about it for his Elmwood Institute newsletter. I was floored. Never had I met or ever expected to meet him. Of course, I was honored to accept, and a week later we met in his home and became friends and colleagues. Some years later, I had the opportunity to share this story with Fritjof, and he just kind of laughed it off. And then, actually, just 2 weeks ago, I hadn't seen him in years, but in San Francisco, when we were there honoring Stan Grof, Fritjof and I found ourselves sitting together at this special event. Now, was this mere coincidence, or is there perhaps a deeper hidden process here in this story? In my reflection, I believe we can discern that there was a clear need for self-purification that had to be done first within me. And then when this happened, it cleared an invisible pathway and made it possible for something entirely unexpected and gracious to come from it all. So I see this as a tiny but illustrative example of the nature of God's mysterious work with the soul. Now, there are different forms of the fire of divine love. So the fire burns as purifying fires, as I've just spoken about. That's one way in which this fire can manifest. Another way is that it burns as the fires of spiritual aspiration, the burning desire within the soul to become one with God. And this is really one of the most precious aspects of the human being. It's that desire to unite with what is greater than us and to become the fullness of who we truly are. And then there's another manifestation, which is what we've been calling, or John of the Cross calls, the living flame of love, this natural, nurturing moment of divine love in the depths of our being that is there and accessible every moment. This flame of love is the Holy Spirit, says John of the Cross. And that flame, every time it flares up, bathes the soul in glory and refreshes it with the quality of divine life. And in his famous poem, The Living Flame of Love, and by the way, his books he has a book by that title, and it's basically a commentary on the poem. The poem is 4 stanzas. The book is, 150 pages. But it's all a commentary, as most of his writings were, on his poetry. And in the last stanza of that poem, it goes like this. O living flame of love, how gently and lovingly you wake in my heart, where in secret you dwell alone. And in your sweet breathing, filled with good and glory, how tenderly you swell my heart with love. In your sweet breathing, how tenderly you swell my heart with love. So John gives us here a crucial hint, a simple practice, which is to feel in your own sweet breathing this tender swelling of your heart with love, as we were doing in the meditation. And I invite you to continue with this practice, to continue taking in your sweet breathing, feeling your heart swell tenderly with love. And as you do this, a gentle light and warmth of the beloved grows inside of you. As we give ourselves to this flame of divine love, we are transformed, purified, uplifted, and remade. And as we are remade, we become part of remaking the world. The union of the flame of love in your heart with the fire of love in the heart of God. Two flames, one fire, one love. As Myrtle Fillmore said, get on fire with this doctrine. Let it be your first, last, and only thought. Our God is a consuming fire. Be the light, health, substance, and beauty of your world. So let us close with just a moment of silence, closing your eyes again, allowing that in-breath, feeling the sweet breathing of your own breath. And on the in-breath, feeling that expanse, that nurturance, that infinitely subtle and precious blessing of life that is given you with each breath, that has never failed you since the moment you emerge from the womb. And feeling that sweet breathing, feeling that tender swelling of your heart with love. And again, sending that love back to the source of love itself. And as we do this, we are fulfilling the first commandment. We are fulfilling the deepest secret of the Bhagavad Gita. We are fulfilling the injunction across all of the theistic traditions. We are uniting soul with source. And through this practice, as John of the Cross says, the soul becomes God, from God, by participation in God and in God's divine attributes. So let us go forth, continuing to radiate this love and warmth and light into the world. God bless you.